Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Charnel House by Graham Masterton, and this week we're starting with Chapter 4. So grab a cup of something hot, sit down and relax, and enjoy the story. Chapter 4. Jane Torresino called. She was sorry she hadn't been around at lunchtime, and she hoped I hadn't been anxious. I glanced across at Dr. Jarvis and said, "Anxious? Do you know what's happened?" "I saw it on television. Seymour Wallace died." "Well, it's worse than that. He died with more blood in his system than Sam Peckinpah gets through in a whole movie. 22 pints. And what's more, Jim here says the blood wasn't even his own. They analyzed it, and it turned out to be some kind of dog's blood." "You're kidding." "Jane, if you think I'm in the mood for kidding—" "Well, I didn't mean that," she said quickly. "What I meant was, it all ties in." "Ties in? Ties in with what?" "That's what I've been trying to tell you," she said. "I went out at lunchtime to Sausalito. You know, all that Indian stuff I was telling you about? Well, I have friends out at Sausalito who know quite a few Indians, and they're all into Indian culture. They'd heard about this demon they call the first one to use words for force, and they think I ought to go up to Round Valley and talk to one of the medicine men." I sighed and said nothing. Jane said, "John, did you hear me?" "Yes," I said, "I heard you." "But you don't think it's a good idea?" "Just wait a moment." I put my hand over the receiver and said to Jim Jarvis, "Jane is convinced that everything that's been happening round at Seymour Wallace's house has been connected with some Red Indian legend. Now she wants to talk to some medicine man upstate. What do you think?" Dr. Jarvis shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it's a good idea. Any theory is better than no theory." I took my hand off the phone. "Okay, Jane, Dr. Jarvis says let's try it." "You couldn't have stopped me anyway," she answered tartly. "Jane," I said, irritated, "I spent the whole damned afternoon trying to find out where you were. We've had 2 people injured and 1 man dead. Right now, the least advisable thing for any of us to do is to go wandering off on our own." "I didn't know you cared," retorted Jane. "You know damned well I do." "Well, if you care that much, you'd better come to Round Valley with me. I'm borrowing Bill Thorogood's car." I put down the phone. At least it was Saturday tomorrow, and I wouldn't have to keep on inventing excuses for Douglas P. Sharp. I said to Dr. Jarvis, "It looks like I've roped myself in. I just hope it's worthwhile." He crushed out his second cigarette and shrugged. "There are times when you come up against things in medicine that make you feel excited, real challenges, like difficult cases of poisoning or unusual compound fractures. At times like that, you feel everything about being a doctor is worthwhile. The hospital politics, the squabbles over financial allocations, the whole bit." He looked up and added, "There are other times, though, like now, when you just don't understand what the hell is happening, and you're powerless. I can spend the rest of the day schlepping around from Dan Machin to Brian Corder to Seymour Wallace, and I won't be able to do a damn thing to help any of them." He reached for the cigarettes. "In other words, John, go on up to Round Valley and consider yourself lucky that you're doing something, because I can't." I looked at Dr. Jarvis for a while, and then I said, "I didn't know doctors got down in the dumps. I thought that only happened on television." Dr. Jarvis coughed, "And I thought that what's happening right now only happened in nightmares." Saturday morning was clean and clear, and we sped across the Golden Gate with the ocean sparkling beneath us, the sun flickering through the bridge's wires and uprights in a bright, stroboscopic blur. Jane sat back in her seat, dressed in a red silk blouse and white Levi's, with huge sunglasses perched on her nose and a red scarf around her hair. Bill Thorogood was lucky enough to own a white Jaguar XJ12 and profligate enough to lend it out, so I sat behind the wheel and pretended I was some minor movie star on a day trip to someplace private and expensive, instead of a sanitation official on a 160-mile flog up to Round Valley. We burned up 101 through Marin and Sonoma counties, through Cloverdale, Preston, and Hopland, and we stopped at Ukiah for lunch, with the sun high and brassy up in the sky and the wind blowing off Lake Mendocino. Sitting on a low breeze-block wall outside a roadside diner, we ate chili burgers and watched as a father tried to cram his 5 kids into the back of his station wagon, along with fishing tackle, inflatable rafts, pup tents, and Wellingtons. Every time he managed to get all of the gear inside, one of the kids would climb out, and then he'd have to get around to the back of the wagon again and rearrange everything. "The futility of life," remarked Jane. "As fast as you do something, it gets itself undone again. I don't think that life's futile." Jane swallowed Coca-Cola from the can. "You don't think that someone's using us as playthings, like now?" "I don't know. I think it's more serious than that. But I believe we have to try to fight it, whatever it is." She reached over and touched my hand. "That's what I like about you, John. You're always ready to fight." We climbed back in the car, and I drove it out of the car park with a squeal of tires. Then we headed north again, speeding on 101 until we reached Longvale, and then turning off into the hills to Dos Rios and the Eel River, and up into Round Valley Reservation. The medicine man we had arranged to see was George Thousand Names. All that Jane knew about him was that he was one of the oldest and most respected of southwestern medicine men, and that he spent more time in San Francisco and Los Angeles than he did upstate, working for Indian investment corporations and protecting Indian rights. Right now, though, he was back home at Round Valley with his family, and anybody that wanted to consult him had to make the trek. The Jaguar bounced slowly across the grass and rutted tracks that led up the valley between tall pines and undulating hills to George Thousand Names' home. He kept himself apart from most of the trailers and houses where the Round Valley Indians lived, up on a wooded ridge overlooking the Eel River. As we made our way up the bumpy trail, his chalet-style house gradually came into view, a split-level architectural designed home with a balcony and wide sliding windows. "Some teepee," remarked Jane. I stopped the Jaguar at the foot of the wooden stairs that led up to the house. Then I climbed out and squinted against the sun, looking for any signs of life. I blew the car horn a couple of times, and then one of the sliding windows opened, and a small man in a plaid shirt and well-pressed slacks came out onto the balcony. "Excuse me," I called. "Are you Mr. Thousand Names?" "I'm George Thousand Names. Who are you?" "John Hyatt, and this is Jane Torresino. Miss Torresino made an appointment with you?" "I'm not a dentist," said George Thousand Names. "You don't have to make appointments, but I remember. Come on up." We climbed the stairs that led up to the balcony, and George Thousand Names came up and shook hands. Up here he looked even smaller, a delicate and diminutive old man with a face as creased and crinkled as a cabbage leaf. He stood very straight, though, and he had an inner dignity about him that immediately made me feel he was someone extremely special. Around his neck hung amulets and necklaces that looked ancient and potent and mysterious, but he wore them as naturally as if they were nothing more than decoration. On his wrist was a Jagerle Coulter wristwatch, solid gold with a tiger's eye face. "Your friends from Sausalito briefly mentioned that you were worried about some of our legends," said George Thousand Names, leading us into the house. It was a calm, elegant place, built of polished pine, with Indian rugs and cushions all around. Through a half-open sliding door, I could see a modernistic kitchen with a ceramic range and microwave ovens. Jane gave George Thousand Names a pottery jar of tobacco she had bought that morning in Healdsburg. "I've heard it's kind of traditional," she said. "I hope you like Klompenklogen." George Thousand Names smiled. "I don't know why white people are always so apologetic in the face of tradition," he said. "Sure, that's a fine brand. Won't you sit down? How about some coffee?" We sat around on comfortable cushions on the floor, while a young Indian girl who was presumably George Thousand Names' maid percolated coffee for us. Just behind George Thousand Names' shoulder, the sun slid in through the wide window like a lance and gave his aged head a brilliant halo of light. George Thousand Names said, "There is something in both of your minds that is troubling you greatly. You fear that you have no comprehension of what it might be, and that you will both be swallowed up by it." "How did you know that?" I asked him. "Very easy, Mr. Hyatt. It shows on your faces. In any case, white people don't usually consult Indian medicine men unless they feel they have exhausted every possible explanation that their own culture can offer." Jane said, "We're not at all sure that this has anything to do with Indian legends, Mr. Thousand Names. It was just a guess, but the more we find out about it, the more things that happen, the more it seems to point that way." "Well, tell me about it, from the beginning." I explained about my job at the sanitation department and how Seymour Wallace had come in to see me about the breathing in his house. Then I described what had happened to Dan Matchin, and next to Brian Corder, and finally to Seymour Wallace himself. I talked about the pictures of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak, and about the bear lady who was missing, and about the door knocker with a hideous face. George Thousand Names listened to all this calmly and impassively. When I'd finally finished, he lifted his head and said, "Do you have any idea what you're describing to me?" I shook my head. Jane said, "The whole reason we've come up here is because we can't understand it. I work in a bookstore, and I looked up Mount Taylor and found there were all these stories about Big Monster connected with it, and the first one to use words for force. I wouldn't have thought much about it, except that the first one to use words for force was supposed to come back by the path of many pieces, or something like that, and it somehow seemed to click. I can't even explain why." The Indian girl brought us coffee in pottery mugs and fresh pecan cookies. She must have had a psychic sensitivity to my innermost thoughts, like George Thousand Names. Being served up with a plate full of fresh pecan cookies almost made up for having Moon River on the brain. George Thousand Names said softly, "Every Indian demon has a common name and a ritual name, like many European demons. There were, for instance, the eye killers, who were said to have been created by a chief's daughter abusing herself with a prong from a sour cactus. Then, as you say, there was Big Monster, whose real name was quite different, and the first one to use words for force." The medicine man seemed to be choosing his words carefully. He bit into a pecan cookie with immaculate dentistry and chewed for a while before he continued. "The first one to use words for force was the most terrible and implacable of all Indian demons. He was wily and cunning and vicious, and his chief enjoyments were causing hatred and confusion and satisfying his lust on women. The reason we call him the first one to use words for force is because his tricks and his savagery created in the hearts of men their first feelings of fury and revenge. As you may know, there are benevolent Indian gods and evil Indian gods. At the great council of the deities, the evil gods sat facing the north, and the good gods sat facing the south. The first one to use words for force, however, was so treacherous and malevolent that he was accepted by neither side, and he sat alone by the door. He was the demon of chaos and disorder. And the Indians sometimes say that when he was asked in ancient days to help to place the stars, he tossed his own handful of stars up into the night sky at random and created the Milky Way. George Thousand Names sipped his coffee. I said, "Is this what we're up against? This first one to use words for force?" The Indian's face gave nothing away. He replaced his coffee mug on its saucer and delicately patted his lips with a clean handkerchief. "From what you have told me, Mr. Hyatt, it seems more than likely." I didn't know whether he was trying to put me on or not. Knowing the dry sense of humor that Indians have, I guessed he could have been pulling our legs. I could just imagine him retelling the story of how the dumb white folks had come all the way up to Round Valley to ask his advice, and how he'd solemnly told them about a demon who threw stars up in the air, and how the white folks had gone away convinced they were up against some ancient red-skinned spirit, and the whole damned tribe would be busting their sides. "Likely?" I asked him cautiously. "What's likely about a demon?" George Thousand Names smiled. "I sense your suspicion," he said, "but I assure you absolutely that I am not playing with you." I couldn't help coloring a little. In front of this medicine man, I felt as if I had a television screen in my forehead, giving a late show on everything I was thinking. Whatever his sense of humor was like, he was a really astute guy. He said, "The first one to use words for force was the only Indian demon to conquer death. He died many times, sometimes as false proof of his love for a woman, sometimes as the consequence of a punishment meted out by other gods. But each time, before he went to the underworld, he made sure that he hid in the upper world the essential ingredients he needed to come back to life again: his breath, his heart, his blood, and the hair which he cut from Big Monster's head." The sun had now dropped behind George Thousand Names' back, and I could hardly make out his face in the darkness. I said, appalled, "His breath, his heart, and his blood?" George Thousand Names nodded. "That's why you were right to come up here, Mr. Hyatt. From what you have said this afternoon, it seems that the first one to use words for force has decided to return to life through the medium of your unfortunate friends." Jane said, "But I don't understand. How could a demon's breath and blood and everything be there, inside a house?" "It's quite easy. The first one to use words for force was banished to the underworld many centuries ago, long before any white man discovered this continent. In those days, medicine men were almost gods in their own right, and even if they weren't actually able to slay the first one to use words for force, they would certainly be capable of sending him temporarily back to the underworld. From what you say, I expect that the demon hid his vital parts in a forest or in the ground, and when this house was constructed, it was unwittingly built out of trees or out of stones in which the first one to use words for force had instilled his many pieces." "But what about all those pictures of Mount Taylor? The demon couldn't have put those up. And what about the door knocker?" George Thousand Names raised his hands. "Of course the demon himself didn't put those artifacts there, but I expect that his influence in the house has been strong for years. Those people who have been unfortunate enough to live there have probably done many things quite unconsciously to prepare the way for the demon's eventual return to life. I expect that the door knocker you talk about is a likeness of the demon's face. And the pictures? Well, who knows? But remember that the ancient Indians used to draw pictures of prominent landmarks from a whole variety of different angles so that they could locate hidden hoards of weapons or supplies or underground springs. All those prints of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak could be a very sophisticated form of pictograph. And if you put them all together, you may find that they lead you to some spot where the first one to use words for force has secreted something important. Like what? Asked Jane. I mean, whatever it is, it must be very important. George Thousand Names smiled at her benevolently. I don't usually like to hypothesize, my dear, but my guess would be that those pictures lead the way to the shorn-off hair of Big Monster. The first one to use words for force cut off Big Monster's hair because it had magical properties which made the wearer invulnerable to human and supernatural weapons. It was said to be as gray as iron, this hair, and as strong as a whip. From what I recall of the legend, the first one to use words for force hid the hair in the New Mexico lands of the Acoma and Canoncito Indians, so that the twin gods who killed Big Monster would never find it. But it was discovered and spirited away, and nobody knows where. Without that hair, the demon would be open to attack and would never have had the stamina he needed to remain in the world of men and living spirits. I sat back on my cushion. George Thousand Names was so calm, so self-possessed, and I could no longer consider he was joking. But what he was saying needed such an enormous stretch of the imagination to believe that I wasn't sure I could accept it even now, no matter how sincerely he had said it. If it hadn't been for Dan Matchin and Brian Corder and Seymour Wallace, I would have politely finished my coffee and left. But two of them were sick, and the third was lying dead in the morgue, and what George Thousand Names had told us was the only explanation that anyone had given us so far. Jane said, if the first one to use words for force is the demon's ritual name, what's his common name? George Thousand Names raised an eyebrow. You've probably heard it, he said. The demon is usually called Coyote. The dogs of the desert were named after him. It's a name that means cunning and vicious trickery. I coughed. Is there any way we can tell if it's really around? Is there any sign, like any giveaway mark? Jane said, like poltergeists, which are frightened of fire, or vampires. George Thousand Names said, Coyote comes in many guises, but you can always recognize him. He has the face of a demonic wolf, and he is always accompanied by signs of bad luck. Like what? Well, like thunderstorms or sickness or certain birds or animals. I felt that familiar freezing sensation around my scalp. Gray birds? I asked the medicine man. Gray birds that sit there and never sing? George Thousand Names nodded. The gray birds are Coyote's most constant companions. He uses their feathers to fletch his arrows, which is something no Indian warrior would ever have done. The gray birds are the birds of disaster and panic. I've seen them. For the first time, George Thousand Names leaned forward, his face intent and pale. You've seen them? Thousands of them, literally thousands. They're all perched on the roof of the hospital where Dan Matchin and Brian Corder and Seymour Wallace were taken. My own sanitation department was around there yesterday trying to get rid of them, but they wouldn't leave. They're actually there? Asked George Thousand Names, as if he couldn't believe what I was saying. You saw them with your own eyes? I nodded. George Thousand Names looked away. His eyes, gleaming and bright in the folded wrinkles of his skin, seemed to be searching into some invisible, faraway distance. He whispered, more to himself than to Jane and me, "Coyote, so it's come to pass." I licked my lips uncertainly. "Mr. Thousand Names," I said, trying not to sound too much like a white tourist bartering for Indian blankets, "is there anything we can do, or is there anything you can do to help us?" George Thousand Names jerked his head towards me and stared at me as if I was losing my bananas. "I? What can I do in the face of a demon like Coyote?" "Well, I don't exactly know, but if you can't do anything, what the hell can we do?" George Thousand Names stood up and walked across to the open window. It was around 5 o'clock now, and the sun was only a couple of hours above the tree line. He stepped out onto the balcony, and Jane and I glanced worriedly at each other as he stood there, gazing out over the hills and the rivers of Round Valley. I stood up too, and followed him out into the open air. There was a fresh smell of pine and wood smoke in the air, and from far away came the echo and re-echo of someone chopping logs. "Someone has set this ancient evil working again," said George Thousand Names hoarsely. "Somehow Coyote has come together again." "I don't follow." The medicine man turned and looked at me. The way the gods and the medicine man dismissed Coyote to the underworld was to make sure that he was split up into parts, and that he had no means of recovering those parts. The first 4 times he died, he hid a flint on his body so that he could dig up his breath and his blood and his heartbeat all over again. The last time he died, the gods made sure that he had no flint and no axe. All that could possibly have conjured him up again was the Bear Maiden. "Mr. Thousand Names," I said, "I don't like to seem ignorant, but these legends are pretty much beyond me. I mean, I find them all a little hard to swallow." George Thousand Names turned away. "Of course you do," he said, in a flat voice that was neither irritated nor indulgent. "How do you think I felt when I first heard about Jesus Christ walking on water?" Jane, who was standing by the open window, said, "Tell us about the Bear Maiden, please." George Thousand Names tiredly pinched the bridge of his nose between finger and thumb. The Bear Maiden was a beautiful girl whom Coyote lusted after. He tried dozens of times to seduce her, but every time she resisted him. It was she who sent him off to the underworld the first few times, to make him prove that he would gladly die for her. In the end, however, she succumbed to his sexual advances, and he gave her a night of love that won her over completely. From that moment on, Coyote filled her mind with evil thoughts, and gradually she changed from a woman into a bear. Her teeth grew long, her nails grew sharp, and dark hair grew down her back. Her greatest pleasure from then on was snapping men's necks with her powerful jaws. Not your fun Saturday night escort, in other words," I remarked. George Thousand Names gave me a down-home look that meant he was a long way away from flippant jokes. "It's quite possible that this man Wallace's statuette, the one he found at Fremont, was enough to provoke Coyote into life. It could have been invested with magic, like a small totem. Did he mention any problems or difficulties at Fremont? Any sickness or argument or inexplicable events?" I said, "Yes. They were building a pedestrian bridge in a park, and apparently the whole damn thing was confusion from beginning to end." "Well, then that's it," said George Thousand Names. "The statuette of Bear Maiden was more than just an antique curiosity. It was the original magical totem which could give Coyote the strength and the will to wake from his sleep in the underworld, and Seymour Wallace brought it into the house." Do you think that was accidental? Asked Jane. I mean, it seems like a tremendous coincidence, him buying that one particular house. George Thousand Names shook his head. From the moment Seymour Wallace dug up that statuette, Coyote was working his influence on him. He told you he felt dogged by bad luck, right? It wasn't bad luck at all. It was the demands of Coyote, drawing him nearer and nearer to Pilarcito Street. I'll bet you something else, too. What's that? Pilarcito Street is the first turning after 5th Street off Mission. I nodded. That's right. George Thousand Names held up the fingers of both hands. 5 plus 1 is 6. Then you have the number 1551. 1 plus 5 is 6. And 5 plus 1 is 6. 3 sixes. 666. The number of the greatest of demons, no matter what culture you're talking about. The mark of the beast. Out there on the balcony, I suddenly felt cold. Jane, in the doorway, shivered. I said, "What are we going to do?" George Thousand Names scratched the back of his neck. 2 practical steps to begin with. First, call up your friend at Elmwood Hospital and have him separate all 3 of Coyote's victims into different clinics or hospitals. That's vital. Second, get hold of those pictures of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak and see if you can work out where that shorn-off hair is located. If you can keep that away from Coyote, you might have half a chance. Third, and this is more difficult, keep any nurses or female doctors or any women at all away from Coyote's different parts. Coyote has a hunger for women's flesh, and that's what he's probably after right now. I took a deep breath. However strange and far-fetched all this legendary stuff seemed to be, I knew that for my own peace of mind, I was going to have to call Dr. Jarvis and tell him. He was intelligent, Jim Jarvis, but he was open to suggestion, and I wondered just what he was going to say when I passed on George Thousand Names' instructions. I said, "Mr. Thousand Names, do you mind if I use your phone?" "Be my guest. Would you care for some firewater?" "I sure would. How about Russian firewater and tonic?" I walked across the polished wooden floor and picked up the phone. Meanwhile, George Thousand Names came back inside and told his maid to bring us some drinks. Then he sat down cross-legged on his Indian-patterned settee and opened up his jar of tobacco. There was a pipe rack on the coffee table next to him, and none of them looked much like a pipe of peace. There were a couple of expensive meerschaums and 3 English briars. The Round Valley Reservation operator put me through to San Francisco, and San Francisco put me through to Elmwood Foundation Hospital. Dr. Jarvis, for once, was free. "Jim," I said, "this is John Hyatt. I'm calling from Round Valley." "Thank God, I've been trying to get you. It's all hell down here." "What's wrong?" "The whole place is going berserk. Your friend, Dan Machin, woke out of his coma and he's locked himself in with Brian Corder. We've tried breaking the door down, but no luck so far. Dr. Kane has just called the police for cutting equipment." Again, the surge of fear. "He's locked himself in? You mean they're together?" "That's right. I don't know what the connection suddenly broke off. I rattled the phone, but the line was completely dead. George Thousand Names said, "Sorry, that happens sometimes. Is anything wrong?" I laid down the useless receiver. "Well, I think there is. Dan Machin has shut himself up with Brian Corder. The hospital staff can't get in there." George Thousand Names steadily packed his pipe with tobacco and reached for his matches. "It sounds as though it started," he said. "Perhaps we'd better get down there." "We?" The Indian girl brought the drinks, and George Thousand Names lifted his glass of bourbon. You don't think I'm going to let white men have this greatest Indian demon all to themselves, do you? This is something that red men are going to talk about for generations to come. Now let's drink to the confusion of our enemies." I raised my vodka. "I don't know about the confusion of our enemies," I said dryly, "but I know damn well that I'm confused as hell." We drove back down to San Francisco that night at over 90 miles an hour, with moths pelting our windshield and our faces strained in the green glow from the Jaguar's instrument panel. Tires squealing, we took the curves down the mountains, and then we hit 101 and snaked southwards through Willits, Ukiah, Cloverdale, and back down into Sonoma County. It was just after midnight when we crossed into Marin County, and it was only when I saw the glitter of San Francisco sprinkled across the darkness of the bay that I eased my foot off the gas and cruised across the Golden Gate at 40. George Thousand Names had been snoring fitfully in the back seat, but he woke up with a start as we turned off Presidio Drive and made our way up towards the hospital. He stretched and said, "The trouble with English cars, they expect you to sit upright all the damn time. What do they think I am, a country squire?" "You didn't have to come," I reminded him, as we took the Elmwood turn-off and bounced down the drive into the hospital forecourt. "That's like trying to tell Custer not to go to the Little Bighorn," retorted George Thousand Names. "Are you that pessimistic?" asked Jane. George Thousand Names blew his nose very loudly. "Pessimism isn't a particularly Indian characteristic. I consulted the day's omens before I left, and they seem okay, although I have to admit that there's a cloud on the horizon no bigger than a man's fist." "There are the birds," I said, pointing. "It looks like the sanitation department gave up trying to get rid of them." Our headlights, as we swung down the driveway, flashed across the ruffled gray ranks of birds. Then I pulled the Jaguar up, and we climbed out, and George Thousand Names stood in the breezy darkness, staring up at the silent, feathery witnesses to Coyote's rebirth. I said, "Well?" He nodded. "There is no doubt at all. These are the rare birds we call gray sadness. They were seen gathering at Wounded Knee and at the funeral of Sitting Bull, and when Rain in the Face died. They are the birds of mourning and bad luck." Jane reached over and held my hand. Her own hand was very cold. She said, "Do they really mean that Coyote is here?" George Thousand Names lifted his head as if he were sniffing the wind. "Can you smell something?" he asked us. I sniffed. "Not much. I have a sinus condition." Jane said, "It's like, I don't quite know what it's like. It's like dogs when they get wet." George Thousand Names nodded. He didn't say anything more. I took Jane's arm and led her into the hospital doors, and he followed, glancing up now and again at the birds, the bringers of gray sadness, with his eyes as wary and fearful as those of a man who was brought into a mortuary to view his father's body. There were 2 uniformed policemen from the SFPD standing guard by the elevators. One of them came across the tiled lobby as we walked in and raised his hand. "I'm sorry, sir, nobody allowed inside right now." "I've come to see Dr. Jarvis. He's expecting us." The policeman examined us suspiciously. "Well, that's too bad. I got strict orders that no one goes up." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "Dr. Jarvis telephoned me 3 or 4 hours ago, and we've come all the way from Round Valley." "Mister," said the policeman patiently, "I don't care if you've come from the planet Mars. My orders are, nobody goes up." The second policeman came across and said, "That's right, those are the orders." "Now hold on a damn minute," I said, but George Thousand Names interrupted me. "We have authority," he told the cop quietly, Do you wish to examine it?" The policeman looked across at him with mistrust, but George Thousand Names reached into his red windbreaker and raised one of the golden amulets that hung around his neck. "What's that?" asked one of the cops. "A Wilkie button?" "Look at it," insisted George Thousand Names. "Examine it." Somehow he caught the light in the lobby with his amulet and flashed it into the policeman's eyes. The policeman appeared to blink and stare and take a step back as if someone had elbowed him right out of the way. I looked at George Thousand Names, and then I looked at Jane, but all Jane could do was shrug. "We have authority to pass," said George Thousand Names loudly. "Do you understand?" The policemen nodded. One of them, like a sleepwalker, turned around and opened the elevator doors for us, and we stepped inside. George Thousand Names told me, "It's all yours, Mr. Hyatt," and I pressed the button for 5. "Is that a kind of hypnosis?" I asked him, as we rose smoothly upward, "the way you used that amulet?" George Thousand Names tucked it back into his windbreaker. "We call it the way of kindly conquest. It's a kind of hypnosis, yes, but it has the advantage of inducing an obedient trance for just a few moments at a time, a few moments which the victim never recalls. You can't make it work on people who are openly aggressive or on people who are determined to resist hypnosis, but it does work quite well on ordinary people whose minds are fairly relaxed." "But won't those policemen come after us?" asked Jane. George Thousand Names shook his head. "It's very doubtful. Right this moment, they're probably standing downstairs shaking their heads, absolutely sure that something's gone wrong, but totally unsure what it could have been." We reached the 5th floor, and the elevator doors slid open. George Thousand Names courteously ushered Jane out into the corridor, and I stepped after them, looking for signs of the terrible panic that Dr. Jarvis had called me about. The corridor was silent. I listened for a while, but I couldn't even hear the normal sounds of a busy private hospital, like trolleys and conversation and intercoms calling for doctors. There was nothing but the click-hum of the elevator as its doors closed behind us and it rose to higher floors. "I guess we'd better try Dr. Jarvis's office first," I suggested. "If he's not there, he'll be down at intensive care." "Lead on," said George Thousand Names. "The sooner we get to grips with this monster, the better." Jane laughed nervously. "You're making this sound like a Frankenstein movie." "It's worse than that," George Thousand Names said pragmatically. We walked along the soft red carpet until we reached Dr. Jarvis's office. I held my breath and rapped on the door. We waited, but there was no reply. George Thousand Names, his eyes as patient as a lizard's in his leathery face, said, "I hope you told this doctor what he was up against." I opened Dr. Jarvis's door and quickly checked his tiny room. It was neat and orderly, and there was even a polystyrene cup of coffee on the desk, left abandoned, like the last lunch on the Marie Celeste. A cigarette butt smoldered in the crowded ashtray. The bottle of gin, almost empty, stood on the filing cabinet. "Spooky," said Jane. "They must be down at intensive care," I said. "It's just along here, on the left." We began to hurry as we turned the corner and made our way toward the intensive care unit. I don't know why, the silence gave us a sense of urgency somehow, as if the longer it stayed silent, the more terrifying everything was going to get. All we could hear was our own breathing and the rustle of our clothes as we walked quickly along. I didn't bother to knock on the double doors of the unit. I just pushed my way into the gloom and the shadows and the blue twilight world where Brian Corder was living out his unnatural life. Dr. Jarvis was there, and so were Dr. Kane and Dr. Weston and Lieutenant Stroud from the police department, and 2 baffled and burly cops. Dr. Jarvis turned as we came in and said, "You made it. I was afraid you wouldn't." "What's going on?" I asked him. "What's happening in there?" Dr. Jarvis took my arm and led me forward to the glass panel which looked into the depths of the unit itself. It was still illuminated with blue light, but somehow the light seemed dimmer and more restless, like the cold phosphorescence that crawls across the sea at night, or the uncanny glow of decaying fish. I could make out the shape of the bed, and around the bed I could still see the chromium stands with saline drips and plasma. I thought I could see the bone-white curve of Brian Corder's skull, too, but on the bed itself there was an indefinable lump of twisted limbs and flesh, and it was too dark to understand what it could possibly be. "Dan Matchen's in there?" I asked Dr. Jarvis. "I don't see where." Jane said, "Can't you get in?" Lieutenant Stroud, tall and urbane as usual, answered, "Miss Torresino, we're not standing out here for our health. We've tried 6 or 7 times to get inside, and each time we've been repulsed." "Repulsed?" I queried. "What do you mean, repulsed?" "Try it for yourself," suggested Lieutenant Stroud. "The door's right there." I stepped forward, but George Thousand-Names said, very softly, "Don't, Mr. Hyatt. It's not worth it." Lieutenant Stroud said, "What do you know?" George Thousand-Names glanced at me through the gloom, and I could see that he was trying to suppress a smile. "This is George Thousand-Names, Lieutenant," I said. "I brought him down tonight from the Round Valley Reservation." "You're still gibbering about this Red Indian stuff?" "You can call it gibbering," I put in quietly, "but so far it's the only reasonable explanation. George Thousand-Names believes that what we're witnessing here is the rebirth of an Indian demon from way back in time." Lieutenant Stroud looked at Dr. Jarvis, then at the other doctors, then at his 2 flatfoots. Then he turned to George Thousand-Names with a sarcastic, beatific smile and said, "A red Indian demon from way back in time? Is that right?" George Thousand-Names was too old and self-possessed to be fazed by sarcasm. He simply nodded and said, "That's right. The demon's name is Coyote, sometimes called the first one to use words for force. He is generally understood to be the demon of confusion, anger, and argument, apart from his insatiable lust for women." Lieutenant Stroud laughed, short and harsh. "The demon rapist?" George Thousand-Names smiled but kept his cool. "That's just about right, Lieutenant. The demon rapist. There's an old Navajo song which tells how Coyote met a young woman on a mountain pass and how he tricked her into lifting her dress for him. It's a charming song in its way, but what it omits is that Coyote was the most fierce and fearsome-looking of all demons anywhere, and that once he'd seduced a woman, he'd generally behave like less than a gentleman." "What do you mean, less than a gentleman?" asked Lieutenant Stroud coldly. George Thousand-Names said, "There are ladies present." "None of the ladies here are going to worry about anatomical details, if that's what you're thinking." "It's not that," replied George Thousand-Names. "It's just that if this demon does manage to bring himself back to life, then no woman in San Francisco will be safe, and I'd hate to frighten these ladies unnecessarily." "Spit it out, will you?" demanded Lieutenant Stroud. "If there's something going on here, I want to know what it is." "Very well," said George Thousand-Names. "Coyote first seduces his women, and then he treats them to what the Navajo used to call the ordeal of 3. Jane said, "Oh my God, I've heard of that." George Thousand-Names touched her arm. It was the strangest of all ancient tortures, and its history goes back far beyond the civilization of the North American tribes. It was said by many of our wise men that it was Coyote's personal invention, but who can say? Dr. Jarvis frowned. I've never heard of the ordeal of 3. What the hell is it? George Thousand Names touched one of the amulets around his neck. He said in a toneless voice, the ordeal of 3 involved cutting open a woman's stomach and sewing into her stomach a live reptile, like a Gila monster, and then cutting open a horse or a cow and disemboweling it and sewing up the woman inside the horse. The art of the torture was to keep all 3 victims, lizard, woman, and horse, alive as long as possible. Dr. Weston said, "Oh, come on. You're just making that up." George Thousand Names shook his head. Check with your anthropologists if you have to. The skeletons of a lizard, a woman, and a horse, one inside the other like a Chinese puzzle, were dug up at Lake Winnemucca in Nevada not 6 years ago by Professor Forrester of the University of Colorado. Lieutenant Stroud pulled at his lower lip. Then he said, "Okay, Mr. Thousand Names, if you know what goes on around here, what do you suggest is going on there?" He pointed through the glass panel to the dim and shadowy forms on the care unit bed. Something was moving in there, some shape, bulky and dark, moving and twitching with that jerky, unpleasant twitching that characterizes the first movements of insects as they work their way out of their chrysalis. George Thousand Names said, "The gray sadness was enough to show me. What you're seeing here is the coming together of Coyote, the foulest of Red Indian demons. When he was banished to the underworld, he concealed his breath and his blood and his heartbeat, and now he's managed to bring them all back together again in one place. He's coming to life, whether you like it or not." Lieutenant Stroud stared at George Thousand Names for quite a while, his eyes glistening attentively in the darkness. He said, "So you really believe it? You really believe that's happening?" George Thousand Names said, "It's not belief, Lieutenant. It's not an act of faith. I know what's happening. It's as plain to me as a flat tire on an automobile is to you. It's a fact." Dr. Jarvis said, "Then what's going on here?" "Go get a flashlight and you'll see," said George Thousand Names, rather too calmly for my liking. "The breath and the heartbeat are joining together. Soon, all Coyote will need is his blood and his terrible face." "Jane," I said, leaning over and speaking quietly in her ear, "the door knocker at Pilarcito Street. Can you go and get it? Knock it off the door with a hammer if you have to." Jane held my arm. "I don't want to leave you, John. Not now." I took out a $10 bill and folded it into her hand. "You won't be away for long. Take a taxi, but just get a hold of that door knocker before anyone else does." Lieutenant Stroud was saying, "We've tried flashlights. It's the angle of the glass or something, but they won't penetrate." George Thousand Names turned from Lieutenant Stroud to Dr. Jarvis and back again. "In that case," he said, "the great Coyote has gained more strength than I thought. He is powerful enough to absorb your light completely." Dr. Weston said, "Absorb? What are you talking about?" George Thousand Names said, "You haven't been reading your Scientific American lately. When an object has sufficient density, it can actually prevent light from reflecting away from it. It attracts the light back to itself by its intense gravitational pull. That's what's happening here. Coyote is a beast of the underworld. He's a living black hole." "You mean he's going to be completely invisible?" asked Dr. Jarvis. George Thousand Names shook his head. "Only when he desires it." Dr. Kane put in, "What about his blood? If his heartbeat and his breath are getting together here, shouldn't we try to isolate Mr. Wallace? He's the vessel for this demon's blood, I presume." Yes, answered the medicine man. Try to get him away, but be careful of the birds, and be careful of any magical tricks that Coyote might try to pull to prevent you doing it. Magical tricks? Asked Lieutenant Stroud, skeptically. Like what? George Thousand Names said, Lieutenant, this may seem like a joke, but it's not. When I say magical tricks, I'm not talking about lifting rabbits out of a hat or sawing ladies in half. I'm talking about death and injury and illusions like you've never seen. I put in, It makes sense, Lieutenant. Everything that George has said so far, it makes sense. Who asked you? Snapped Lieutenant Stroud. Dr. Jarvis said, There's no point in arguing, Lieutenant. None of us has a better idea. You don't think so? Said Lieutenant Stroud, turning around. Well, maybe I've got a better idea. Maybe this whole damn thing is a hoax. A hoax? I said. You think we'd take the flesh off a man's skull for a hoax? Well, all this damn stupid stuff about Indian demons. Stuff? Said George Thousand Names, bristling. You call our demons stuff? Are you crazy? Do you know what Coyote can do? Do you have any idea? Lieutenant Stroud was taken aback by George Thousand Names' ferocity. He said meekly, Well, you mentioned the ordeal of 3. That's nothing, retorted George Thousand Names. That's what he does with the women he's played with and thrown aside. Coyote has powers beyond all human comprehension, powers that made it almost impossible for all the good and evil gods combined to destroy him. And that's without the added powers he stole from other demons like Big Monster and the Lugaroos. The Lugaroos? Said Lieutenant Stroud in disbelief. That's what the French colonists called them when they first came to America. It's a corruption of loups-garous, which means werewolves. Coyote took powers from all of them. He covers his back with the hide of a werewolf and wears on his head the scalp of Big Monster, and with those he is almost indestructible. Lieutenant Stroud listened to this outburst and then stood there silent for a long moment while all of us watched his face, wondering how the hell he was going to respond. I thought at first he was going to dismiss everything that George Thousand Names had said as garbage, and then I saw his expression soften and the lines around his mouth deepen, and I knew that the medicine man's conviction had almost convinced him. He said, I want to know what's going on in there, inside that room. I want you to explain it to me. George Thousand Names stepped forward. The blue light that irradiated from the intensive care unit made his eyes glisten and painted the lines and creases of his face in ultramarine. He raised one shriveled hand, his fingers decorated with silver rings, and his wrist hung with bead bracelets, and pressed it against the glass, as if he could feel vibrations from the dark and twisted mass that was Dan Matchin, or Brian Corder, or both of them, or neither. With his other hand holding his golden amulet, he said softly, It is almost time for Coyote to make himself live once more, to model himself out of the clay of human flesh. He needs blood, but he can rise without blood. He is molding himself from the bodies of those who possess his heartbeat and his breath. Look. All the time that George Thousand Names had his hand pressed to the window, he must have been mentally struggling against the powers of Coyote, because when he said, Look, the blue light rose and brightened as if a dynamo had been suddenly turned faster, and in that brief and horrifying brightness we actually saw what it was that he had been trying to explain to us. We saw the beginnings of Coyote, the demon, the rapist and traitor, the first one to use words for force. On the bed we saw limbs rising and falling, At first they looked like the arms and legs of people drowning in a lake of darkness, but then the contorted mass of flesh seemed to rise up and stand almost upright, and all I could do was stare at what it was and feel a horrifying shudder all the way down my back. In some unspeakable way, Dan Machin and Brian Corder had been twisted together as one creature. It was almost 8 feet tall, rearing blindly off the bed with Brian's fleshless skull as its head, but with both men's arms and legs reaching out toward us. Their torsos were combined in a shapeless double torso of knotted muscle, and Dan Machin's ghastly face appeared momentarily from inside the beast's stomach, pressed against the translucent skin with its mouth wide open in a hellish howl. Dr. Jarvis said, "It's impossible," and Dr. Weston moaned as if she was hurt. But then the blue light dimmed again, and all we could see was the murky outline of that monstrous creature and the white reflection of the emergency lamps from what had once been Brian Corder's head. Lieutenant Stroud, his voice dry, said, "All right, Mr. Thousand Names, what is it?" George Thousand Names lifted himself wearily away from the window. "It's Coyote," he said simply. "He takes on many forms, but this one more than most. It could have been a woman, or a deer, or even a fish. He is once said to have molded his earthly manifestation out of a girl and a tarantula. But tonight he's lucky. He has 2 strong young men for his reincarnation, and downstairs in the morgue you have Seymour Wallace's blood." "Did you give orders to get rid of that blood?" demanded Lieutenant Stroud. Dr. Jarvis said, "Dr. Kane's taken care of it. Seymour Wallace's body should be halfway to Redwood City by now." "Redwood City?" asked the lieutenant. "What's at Redwood City?" "Elmwood Foundation finances a cryogenic research center at Redwood. We can put Seymour Wallace on ice for as long as we like." I said, "What are we going to do about that?" And I pointed towards the bulky shape in the intensive care unit. "We can't just leave it the way it is." Lieutenant Stroud gave me an impatient glance, as if to tell me to mind my own damned business. But he went up to Dr. Jarvis and laid his hand confidingly on his shoulder. "Doctor," he said, "is that thing a threat to human life, to the lives of your staff?" Dr. Jarvis licked his lips. "I don't have any evidence of that. So far I've seen nothing more than extreme physiological abnormality. It hasn't threatened us in any way at all." George Thousand Names butted in. "Coyote's very existence is a threat. Once he has his blood running through his veins again, he'll tear us to pieces." "You have some proof?" asked Lieutenant Stroud. "I'm not doubting your words, sir, but that thing in there is kind of human, and I'm not authorized to shoot human beings unless I have reasonable grounds to believe that they may be threatening life or property." George Thousand Names stood stiff as the spine on a porcupine, his eyes blazing. He pointed with a rigid arm towards the intensive care unit and said, "That, Lieutenant, is Coyote, returned from the underworld. What more can I tell you? That's Coyote." Lieutenant Stroud looked across at his 2 officers, and one of them raised his eyebrows as if to suggest that George Thousand Names may not have all of his marbles. "What do you think, Doctor?" the lieutenant asked Dr. Weston. "Is that a Red Indian demon or not? Or is it just a medical freak?" Dr. Weston, although she was shaken by what she had seen in the intensive care unit, said, "It's a freak. It has to be. I've never seen anything like it, but we can't kill it." Dr. Jarvis said, Supposing nothing," interrupted Dr. Weston. "Jim, this thing is the strangest medical event we've ever seen. It's like Siamese twins being created in front of your eyes. We can't destroy it now. There's no way." I put in, "Dr. Weston, you didn't see Brian Corder hurt. You didn't see Dan Matchin when his eyes lit up like a devil's. You can't say that. Whatever it is in there, whether it's a demon or not, we've got to make sure it doesn't kill anyone else." Dr. Weston was about to answer, but she never had the chance. What happened next was like a road accident. It blurred past my eyes so fast that it was hard to understand anything. I do remember one or two vivid and horrifying things, though, and I guess they're going to stay in my mind forever. Dr. Jarvis suddenly said, "It's coming this way!" And just as we turned to look at the intensive care unit, there was a blast of shattering glass, and thousands of fragments of the observation panel sprayed across the room in a razor-sharp hail. One of the cops dropped to his knees at once, his face like chopped liver, and the other one turned away with his hands over his eyes and blood running down his fingers. My own cheeks were slashed in the glittering, tumbling burst of glass, but it wasn't the glass that frightened me. It was the apparition of Coyote, rearing up like a huge, pale, praying mantis, his skull grinning fixedly on top of its shapeless trunk, his forearms smashing the remains of the window aside without pain or hesitation. And there was the heat. The appalling, scorching heat. It must have been 200 degrees inside that intensive care unit, and now a dry, roasting wind moaned and howled as it surged out of the broken window. Lieutenant Stroud plucked his police special from his pants and fired twice at the monstrous Coyote, but the demon waved one arm towards him, and he was hurtled away across the room, cracking his back against the wall, his gun skidding off into the slush of broken glass. Dr. Jarvis shrieked, "John, hold him!" But I knew that there was no way we were going to hold this thing back, and I wrenched open the door and shouted, "Forget it! For God's sake, get out of here!" George Thousand Names, his hands lifted to protect his head, scrambled out of the room as quickly as he could. Dr. Weston followed him, and then me, and then Dr. Jarvis. The cop with the bleeding eyes was trying to help Lieutenant Stroud, but the demon waved his arm again, and the cop shrieked and staggered helplessly towards the door. "I'm burning!" he yelled. "Put me out! For God's sake, I'm burning!" Dr. Jarvis ran towards him, but then the cop opened his mouth, and a fierce gout of flame gushed out from between his lips. He was blazing inside. His stomach and his lungs were on fire, and every time he tried to cry for help, a monstrous funnel of superheated flames bellowed out. Dr. Jarvis hollered, "John, a blanket! Get me a blanket!" But it was too late. The cop rolled against the side of the corridor and slid to his knees, leaving a trail of fiercely burning blood on the wall. Then he collapsed and lay still, and in front of our eyes, to our overwhelming horror, the flames that were burning inside him gradually broke out, singeing and then setting fire to his uniform from inside, and then engulfing his whole body, and he lay on the carpet, blazing like a ritual suicide. There was another moan of hot air from inside the room, and we heard something like a grumble and a roar, the sound of a devilish beast that was determined to destroy us. Then, miraculously, Lieutenant Stroud came diving out of the doorway, rolling sideways towards us, and gasping for air like an athlete who's testing his threshold of pain. George Thousand Names and Dr. Jarvis knelt down beside him. I'm okay, he told them, trying to stand up. "My back's bruised, but I think I'm okay. For God's sake, let's get out of here. That thing's gone crazy." George Thousand Names said, "Not crazy. That's his natural behavior. He's going to destroy and devour us, and there's nothing we can do." Lieutenant Stroud painfully climbed to his feet, his eyes fixed on the dark doorway where Coyote was hiding. "Well, maybe there's nothing that you can do, Medicine Man, but I know what I'm going to do. That thing in there has declared war, and if it's war he wants, he's damned well going to get it." George Thousand Names reached out and held the lieutenant's arm. "Please, Lieutenant, you're not dealing with a creature from the Black Lagoon. Bombs and tear gas could never hurt Coyote. All you can do is to—" His words were drowned in a roar that shook the whole building. Pieces of broken door, ribbons of shredded carpet, fragments of plaster, and a dry, fierce heat that stank of animals and death came blasting over us. It was Coyote, coming out in search of his blood, coming out in search of his face, and coming out to slaughter us. It was Coyote, the demon of wrath and fear. Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of The Charnel House by Graham Masterton. And until then, have a great week, everyone.